Philadelphia had always been a city that carried its history like a weight on its shoulders. Its cobblestone streets bore the echoes of revolution. Its alleyways whispered the secrets of long-forgotten crimes, and its old buildings seemed to breathe with the slow exhalations of time itself. Tourists wandered through its historic districts, oblivious to the undercurrents of something much older than the country itself. But those who lived here, the ones who had grown up with the city's peculiarities, knew better. They knew that some places were best left alone, that certain streets should not be walked after dark, and that the city sometimes spoke in ways only a few could hear. Christopher Lorne was not from Philadelphia, which is why he failed to notice these warnings. A transplant from Chicago, he had arrived in the city 6 months prior for a research position at the Historical Preservation Society. His job was to catalog overlooked urban myths, lost histories, and stories that had never made it into textbooks. At first, he was thrilled. Philadelphia was a gold mine of strange tales, from the ghosts of Eastern State Penitentiary to the secret tunnels beneath the streets. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that some histories refused to stay buried. It started with the cobblestones. One night, while walking home from a late shift at the archives, Christopher took a shortcut through Elfreth's Alley, one of the oldest residential streets in the country. The alley was empty, the gas lamps casting long, wavering shadows against the red brick facades. He had walked this way before without incident, but that night something was different. The moment he stepped onto the cobblestones, a strange sensation swept over him, like stepping into a memory that wasn't his. The air smelled of burning wood and damp earth, as if the past itself had curled around him. Then came the whispers. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. The sounds were soft, unintelligible, as though voices were carried on the breeze from some unseen gathering. But as he walked, they grew clearer, forming words that made no sense in any language he recognized. He turned, expecting to see someone behind him, but the alley was empty. The shadows seemed to shift, stretching unnaturally across the ground. His pulse quickened, but he kept walking, forcing himself to dismiss it as exhaustion. Halfway through the alley, he stumbled. Looking down, he realized that one of the cobblestones was loose. It jutted out slightly, as if something beneath it was pushing up from underground. Instinctively, he knelt to inspect it, brushing his fingers over the worn surface. It was then that he saw the inscription. The words were faint, nearly eroded by time, but he could still make them out. Do not listen. Do not follow. A chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just the warning that unsettled him. It was the fact that he recognized the handwriting. It was identical to the script used in a 1780s journal he had been transcribing earlier that day. The journal belonged to an anonymous Philadelphia resident who had documented strange occurrences throughout the city. Flickering figures seen in doorways, voices whispering warnings in the night, shadows that moved without cause. But that journal had been written over 200 years ago. Christopher stood quickly, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was thick, unnatural, pressing against him like a living thing. He turned and hurried out of the alley, his footsteps unnaturally loud against the stones. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of his apartment, locking the door behind him and forcing himself to laugh at his own paranoia. But later that night, as he lay in bed, he realized something was wrong. He could still hear the whispers, not outside his window, not in the hallway, but beneath his floor, and they were getting louder. Christopher did not sleep that night. The whispers beneath his floorboards came and went in waves, rising to an almost conversational murmur before fading into near silence, only to return minutes later. He lay stiff in bed, staring at the ceiling, unsure if he was losing his mind. At one point, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and pressed his ear to the hardwood floor, half expecting to hear nothing but the usual creaks of an old building settling into the night. Instead, the voices became clearer. They were speaking English now. Not the English of today, but something older, its cadences strange, its syllables clipped and formal. Christopher caught fragments of sentences, warnings, pleas, something about a debt and the hollow city, before he jerked back, his pulse hammering. He scrambled to his feet, flipping on every light in his apartment as if brightness alone could chase away whatever was lurking beneath him. But the voices didn't care about the light. They whispered on. By dawn, the sounds had faded, but Christopher could still feel them, like an echo trapped in his bones. He resolved to leave his apartment as soon as possible, to surround himself with the living and the ordinary. He threw on a coat and stepped outside into the pale morning, the city waking sluggishly around him. He wasn't sure where he was going, anywhere that wasn't here. Philadelphia had always been eerie in the early hours, its colonial architecture standing like sentinels from another era. The city was at its quietest then, the usual hum of traffic reduced to a distant murmur. Christopher found himself wandering without direction, his mind still tangled in the events of the previous night. It wasn't until he turned on a market street that he noticed something strange. A man was watching him. The stranger stood beneath a flickering streetlight, his face obscured by the brim of an old-fashioned hat. He wore a long coat, the kind that might have been fashionable in the 1800s, and his posture was unsettling. Too still, too patient, as if he had been waiting for Christopher to arrive. A cold dread settled in Christopher's stomach. He quickened his pace, hoping to shake the feeling of being observed, but as he passed a shop window, he saw the man's reflection. He wasn't standing beneath the streetlight anymore. He was closer now. Christopher whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. But the sidewalk was empty. The streetlight flickered once more and then steadied, casting its glow over nothing but damp pavement. The man was gone. A heavy silence filled the space where he had stood, as if the air itself was still holding its breath. Christopher swallowed hard and forced himself to move. He needed to get to his office. He needed to be somewhere that made sense. But as he walked, something gnawed at him. Something worse than the whispers, worse than the strange figure beneath the streetlight. It was the reflection in the window. For the briefest moment before he turned, Christopher could have sworn the man wasn't just standing behind him. He had been reaching for him. Christopher arrived at his office at the Historical Preservation Society well before anyone else. The old brick building near Washington Square was usually a comforting sight, a place of quiet study where the past could be analyzed with detachment. But today it felt different, less like a sanctuary and more like a space that wasn't entirely his. The whispers, the inscription on the cobblestone, the man beneath the streetlight, each detail pressed against his thoughts like cold fingers. Inside, the air smelled of aged paper and dust, the kind of scent that usually grounded him. He dropped his coat onto his desk and sat heavily in his chair, rubbing his temples. He needed logic, something tangible to explain what was happening. His mind returned to the journal he had been transcribing, the one with the same handwriting as the inscription in Elfreth's Alley. He pulled the scanned pages from his drawer and flipped to the entries that had unsettled him most. The journal was written in the late 18th century by an unnamed Philadelphian, someone who claimed to have heard the city breathing. The entries described cobblestones that moved on their own, voices whispering warnings in empty alleyways, and a constant, creeping sense of being watched. The writer had been obsessed with a concept they called the Hollow City, a Philadelphia that existed beneath the one everyone else knew. Christopher had initially dismissed it as paranoia, the ramblings of a man who had spent too much time alone. But now, after his own experience, he wasn't so sure. He skimmed the pages for anything that could provide clarity, his hands trembling slightly. Then he found something new. A loose page had been tucked between the others, one he hadn't noticed before. The paper was older than the rest, more brittle, as if it had been inserted long after the original journal had been written. The message was short, scrawled in the same slanted handwriting. "Do not follow the invitations." Christopher's skin prickled. Invitations? He had received nothing of the sort. But as he set the page down, a quiet rustling sound made him freeze. It hadn't come from the journal. It had come from his desk. Slowly, he turned his gaze downward. A folded envelope sat there, resting on the wood as if it had always been there. But Christopher was certain it hadn't been. He would have seen it when he sat down. His breath shallowed as he reached for it, the paper feeling impossibly cold against his fingers. The envelope had no name, no return address, just an old wax seal pressed into its flap. The symbol was unfamiliar, an intricate emblem that resembled a city's skyline, but warped, as if the buildings had started to sink into the ground. His pulse pounded as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The message was brief, handwritten in the same elegant script as the warning in the journal. "You have been seen. Come to where the city splits. Midnight." Christopher stared at the words, feeling something between terror and inevitability. The city splits. He knew where that was. There was only one place in Philadelphia described that way: the old underground tunnels beneath the city, where two historic passageways met. He exhaled shakily and set the letter down. He told himself he wouldn't go. That would be the logical thing. But deep down, he already knew he would. Christopher spent the rest of the day in a fog, his mind fixated on the letter. He told himself over and over that he wouldn't go, that he shouldn't even entertain the idea. Yet every attempt to focus on his work was met with failure. The words in the old journal blurred together. The rustle of papers in his office sounded like the faintest whisper of his name, and each shadow in the hallway felt deeper than it should have been. By the time night fell, the city outside his window had shifted into something unfamiliar. Philadelphia had always been a city that carried its past like a second skin, but now it felt as though that past was stirring. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him like damp air. He lasted until 11:30 before finally grabbing his coat and heading for the tunnels. The entrance was easy enough to find, an old maintenance door near an abandoned stretch of South Street, a place where the cobblestones still peeked through modern pavement. He hesitated at the rusted handle, heart pounding. He could still turn back. He could pretend none of this had happened, but the city had already seen him. The lock clicked open with a sound far too loud in the empty street. Christopher stepped inside and descended the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with every step. The tunnels beneath Philadelphia had once been used for everything from prohibition smuggling to Revolutionary War supply routes. Now, they were forgotten, their existence known only to historians, city workers, and, apparently, whoever had sent that letter. His phone flashlight cast long, trembling shadows against the brick walls. The passage twisted and turned, narrowing in places until Christopher had to squeeze through, feeling the weight of the earth pressing in around him. He had studied these tunnels before, but tonight they felt different, deeper somehow, as if they extended beyond the maps he had memorized. At exactly midnight, he reached the place where the city split. The chamber was larger than he expected, with a vaulted ceiling of old stone, worn smooth with age. Two tunnels diverged here, stretching into unknown darkness. But it wasn't the tunnels that caught his attention. It was the figures. 3 of them stood at the far end of the chamber, barely visible in the dim light. They were dressed in clothes that did not belong to this century. Long coats, high collars, the kind of attire seen in faded daguerreotypes. None of them moved. Christopher swallowed hard. "I got your letter," he said, his voice small in the vast space. One of the figures tilted its head. Then, slowly, one of them stepped forward, the faint scuff of boots against stone the only sound. As they neared the light, Christopher felt his breath catch. It was the man from beneath the streetlight. Up close, he was even more unsettling, his features sharp and pale, his eyes sunken as if he had not slept in years. But there was something else, something that made Christopher's stomach twist. The man looked familiar, not in the way that a stranger might remind you of someone you once knew, but in a way that made Christopher feel as though he had seen him before. Somewhere, the man studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You shouldn't have come," he said softly. Christopher shivered. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And behind him, deep in the tunnels where the light did not reach, something began to move. For a moment, Christopher was frozen, his breath shallow as he strained to hear beyond the eerie silence of the chamber. The movement in the tunnels behind him was subtle, a slow, deliberate shifting, as if something vast and unseen had just woken up. The man before him did not flinch. The other 2 figures remained still, watching him as if waiting for a decision he did not know he had to make. "You shouldn't have come," the man repeated, and this time, There was something almost mournful in his tone. Christopher swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave these tunnels behind and return to the city above. But he had already gone too far. He had read too much, seen too much. He could feel the weight of history pressing against him, as if he was standing at the intersection of two Philadelphias, the one he had always known, and something older, something buried beneath centuries of stone. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, his sharp features unreadable. Then, he gestured toward the deeper tunnel behind him, the one that sloped downward into absolute blackness. "This is where the city begins," he said. Christopher's pulse pounded. "The Hollow City," he murmured. He had seen the name scrawled in the old journal, had read about whispers in the dark and cobblestones that moved. He had dismissed it as folklore, the hallucinations of a man lost to time. But now, standing here, he wasn't so sure. A sound echoed from the tunnel behind him, closer this time, a slow, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Christopher's fingers tightened around his phone, its dim light casting jittery shadows on the walls. The man's gaze flickered past him toward the sound. "You need to make a choice," he said quietly. "You can leave now and forget this place, or you can follow us and understand what you were never meant to see." Christopher hesitated. Every rational part of him screamed at him to turn back, to run. But there was something else, something deep in his bones that wouldn't let him. He had spent years studying history, digging through archives, searching for lost stories. And now, one was opening itself to him. He took a step forward. The man nodded as if he had expected this. Without another word, he turned and led Christopher deeper into the tunnels. The other two figures followed silently. The air grew colder with each step, the walls narrowing, the bricks giving way to rough-hewn stone. The deeper they went, the stronger the feeling of wrongness became. Then Christopher saw it. The passage widened into a cavernous space, far larger than should have been possible beneath the city. The ceiling arched high above, lined with the remains of old structures, buildings that looked as though they had been swallowed whole. Cobbled streets wound through the darkness, lined with crumbling doorways and shattered windows. An entire city lay beneath Philadelphia, hidden and silent, its architecture mismatched as if it had been built in different centuries. Some of the buildings were familiar, recreations of long-demolished structures Christopher had seen in old sketches. Others were impossible, defying the laws of physics, twisted at strange angles as if reality had warped around them. The Hollow City was real. Christopher's breath hitched. His mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. This isn't possible," he whispered. The man beside him simply watched. "It has always been here," he said, "long before the city above. Before the first brick was laid, before the first street was named. It waits beneath, changing, shifting. And now, it has seen you." A chill crawled up Christopher's spine. He had spent his life studying history, believing it was something stable, something written in stone. But here, beneath Philadelphia, history was alive, and it was watching him back. Christopher stood at the edge of the Hollow City, his mind struggling to make sense of the impossible sight before him. The vast underground expanse stretched into the darkness, lined with structures that did not belong to any single era. Some buildings looked like relics from the colonial period, their facades adorned with faded signage and shattered lanterns. Others were even older, their walls composed of stone, so ancient it seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. But it was the streets that unsettled him the most. Narrow, winding paths of uneven cobblestone, shifting ever so slightly, as though they were alive. "This place shouldn't exist," Christopher murmured, his voice barely audible against the oppressive silence. The man who had led him here simply nodded, his expression unreadable. The two figures who had accompanied them remained still, their faces obscured by the shadows. Christopher took a tentative step forward, feeling the uneven stones beneath his feet. The ground was damp, but not with water. It was something thicker, something that clung to his soles. He resisted the urge to look down. He didn't want to see. The man beside him finally spoke. "The Hollow City is older than Philadelphia. older than anything you've read about. The streets above are only a reflection, a fragile imitation of what was already here. His voice carried a quiet reverence, as though he were speaking of something sacred. Christopher frowned, his historian's mind struggling against the absurdity of it all. "But that doesn't make sense," he said. "Cities don't just grow underneath other cities. Someone had to build this." The man turned to face him, the dim glow of Christopher's phone casting eerie shadows across his gaunt face. "Who said it was built?" he asked. A shiver crept down Christopher's spine. He opened his mouth to respond, but then he heard it, the sound of something shifting in the distance. It wasn't the scrape of stone against stone. It was slower, deeper, a breath. He turned sharply, his flashlight beams sweeping across the hollow city's labyrinthine streets. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a figure disappearing into an alleyway, its silhouette unnaturally long. His pulse quickened. "What was that?" The man did not react. "This place is not abandoned," he said calmly. "It has always been occupied." Christopher took a step back. The city around him suddenly felt tighter, like the walls were closing in. "Occupied by what?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The man did not reply. Instead, he gestured toward a building at the end of the street, an old townhouse, its windows shattered, its doors slightly ajar. "If you want to understand, you must go inside," he said. Christopher hesitated. The air around him felt heavier, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. But he had come too far to turn back now. His entire life had been spent chasing forgotten histories, uncovering lost truths. And here, beneath Philadelphia, was the greatest secret of all. Slowly, he stepped toward the townhouse, its doorway yawning open like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Behind him, the city exhaled again. Christopher hesitated before stepping inside the ruined townhouse. The door, slightly ajar, groaned as he nudged it open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp wood and something older, something like earth that had been undisturbed for centuries. His phone's flashlight cut through the blackness, illuminating dust motes that hung in the still air like suspended ash. The silence inside was different from the quiet of the tunnels. It felt watchful. The floorboards beneath his feet were warped, swollen with moisture and time. The layout of the house was familiar. Philadelphia had plenty of historic homes from the 18th and 19th centuries, but something about this one felt wrong. The angles were just slightly off, the walls bowed in ways that defied logic, and the ceiling seemed lower than it should have been, pressing down on him like a heavy hand. He took a few cautious steps forward, running his fingers along the wall. The wallpaper, long faded and peeling, felt damp to the touch. He glanced back toward the doorway, where the man and his silent companions remained outside, watching but not following. "Why here?" Christopher asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression was unreadable. "This house remembers." A chill crawled up Christopher's spine. He turned back toward the dim interior and pushed forward, his flashlight sweeping over the room. Old furniture sat frozen in time. Chairs draped in tattered cloth, a grand piano covered in dust, its keys yellowed and cracked. A mirror hung on the far wall, but when Christopher's light hit it, the reflection was off. The room in the glass was not quite the one he was standing in. His breath caught. He stepped closer. The mirror's surface shimmered as if it were water. He saw himself standing there, but behind his reflection, the shadows moved, twisting, writhing. Something else was in the mirror's version of the house. Something watching. A whisper, just behind his ear. Christopher spun around, but the room was empty. His pulse hammered in his throat. He turned back to the mirror. His reflection remained, but now there was someone standing behind it. A woman in a long, tattered dress, her face blurred as if smeared by time. Then she turned her head. The motion was slow, deliberate. Her features remained indistinct, but Christopher felt her gaze settle on him, drilling into his bones. His flashlight flickered. The room darkened, the shadows stretching, reaching. The house breathed. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on the uneven floor. The walls creaked, the very structure of the house shifting like something was waking up. His flashlight trembled in his grip, the beam flickering across the warped furniture, the distorted angles, the doorway that now seemed impossibly far away. And then a whisper, low and knowing, curling against his ear like smoke. "You are not supposed to be here." Christopher bolted for the exit, his heart slamming against his ribs. The moment his foot hit the threshold, the house behind him exhaled, a deep, resonant sigh that rattled the windows and sent a gust of stale air rushing past him. The man outside remained unmoved. His companions had stepped back slightly, their heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. Christopher spun toward them, his breath ragged. "What the hell was that?" The man regarded him for a long moment before answering. "This city remembers, and now it remembers you." Christopher staggered back from the townhouse, his breath uneven, his mind scrambling for logic where there was none. His pulse still pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant echoes of the hollow city. The man who had led him here stood silently, his eyes betraying neither satisfaction nor concern. Behind him, the two silent figures remained as motionless as before, their presence more unnerving now than ever. "This city remembers me?" Christopher repeated, his voice hoarse. "What does that mean?" The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering the weight of Christopher's question. "Philadelphia is built on layers," he said finally. "You've spent your life studying the ones you can see. But there are deeper layers, older layers. Some things are meant to stay buried. But now," he trailed off, his gaze shifting toward the townhouse. "Now it's awake." Christopher swallowed hard. He turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see the woman from the mirror standing in the doorway, watching. But there was nothing, just the warped wood, the shattered windows, and a deep sense of something pressing against his consciousness, as if the house itself was aware of his presence. "This is insane," he muttered, dragging a hand down his face. "This isn't history. This isn't science. It's real," the man interrupted. Christopher exhaled sharply. He had spent his entire career debunking myths, separating folklore from fact, uncovering what time had hidden. He had never believed in ghosts, curses, or the supernatural. But tonight, he could not explain what he had seen. He could not rationalize the woman in the mirror, the whisper at his ear, the way the house had shifted like a living thing. "I need to get out of here," he said finally. The man gave a slight nod. "You can leave," he said. "But the city won't forget you now." The weight of those words settled over Christopher like damp earth on a coffin. He turned, his flashlight still trembling in his grip, and began walking back toward the passage that had led him here. The hollow city stretched out before him, its streets darker than before, its unseen inhabitants watching. As he moved, he became aware of something else. A sound, faint at first but growing louder. A name. His name. It came from the walls, from the cobblestone streets, from the very air. A whisper at first, then a murmur, then a chorus of voices overlapping. "Christopher. Christopher. Christopher." He broke into a run. The passage loomed ahead, the archway marking the boundary between the impossible and the world he knew. He sprinted toward it, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, stretching the distance. The whispers turned into something else, laughter, crying, a sound that was both and neither. He reached the passage and lunged through. The moment he crossed the threshold, the hollow city behind him fell silent. He turned back. The entrance was gone. Nothing but solid rock remained where the archway had been. Christopher's breathing was ragged. His hands trembled as he ran them over the wall, searching for a seam, a crack, anything. But there was nothing. The man's voice drifted toward him from the darkness. "You were invited in," he said. "You don't leave until it lets you." Christopher turned, his stomach twisting. The hollow city had not let him go. It had swallowed him whole. Christopher pressed his hands against the cold stone where the passage had been, his fingers searching for any sign of a hidden seam, a crack, anything that could prove he wasn't trapped. The rock was solid, unyielding. His breath came fast, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. He turned back toward the hollow city, the twisted underbelly of Philadelphia, where the streets seemed to ripple like liquid shadow under the dim glow of gaslights that had no visible source. The narrow alleys wound in directions that defied logic, leading to doorways that should not exist. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, old paper, and something metallic, something like blood. The man and his silent companions remained where they were, watching him without expression. "You feel it now, don't you?" the man asked, his voice calm, almost amused. Christopher clenched his fists. "Let me out," he demanded. The man tilted his head. "I told you. The city remembers you now." Christopher's stomach twisted. The whispers had stopped when the passage disappeared, but the silence was worse. It was expectant, as though the very walls of this place were listening. He took a slow step forward. The cobblestone beneath his feet felt wrong, softer than stone should be, like packed soil that had never truly settled. He looked down. The stones weren't carved. They were grown, twisting in unnatural patterns. The deeper he breathed, the more he felt it, something alive beneath the surface, just out of reach. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself. "This is just some psychological trick." A sound interrupted his thoughts. A sharp, wet crack. Christopher turned toward the noise, his flashlight beams sweeping across the empty street. Another crack. It echoed from the walls, the ground, the buildings themselves. It was the sound of something breaking free from beneath. The cobblestone shifted. Christopher stumbled backward as the ground beneath him trembled. The streets were moving, not collapsing, not sinking, but shifting as though something massive, something ancient, was breathing beneath them. He felt it before he saw it. A shudder ran up his spine, an instinctive warning buried deep in his bones. And then a hand. It emerged between the cobblestones, pale and skeletal, its fingers too long, its joints bending the wrong way. The skin was stretched thin over the bones, and as it clawed its way up, the sound of tearing flesh and grinding stone filled the air. Christopher couldn't move. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. The hand flexed, its fingers curling into the ground as something else pushed upward. A face. Hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A mouth that was too wide, its grin stretching as though it had no end. More hands broke through the street. More faces. More empty, grinning mouths. Christopher turned and ran. The laughter started then. Not the whispers from before, not the murmurs of forgotten voices, but laughter. It poured from the cracks in the street, from the walls of the buildings, from the very air around him. The laughter of something that had been waiting. His feet pounded against the cobblestones, but the streets twisted ahead of him, shifting like a maze that was closing in. No matter which way he turned, the alleys stretched, curved, rerouted, guiding him deeper, deeper into the hollow city. Christopher's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as he sprinted through the shifting streets. The city seemed alive, thrumming with an energy he couldn't understand, twisting and rearranging itself to trap him in an unending labyrinth. Every time he thought he had found an exit, the road curled back on itself, pulling him deeper into the heart of the hollow city. The laughter echoed from every direction, a sound that crawled under his skin, gnawing at his sanity. The faces, twisted and grotesque, appeared again and again from the cracks in the ground and the sides of the buildings, their eyes empty but unblinking, their smiles stretched wide as though they knew something Christopher didn't. They moved, sometimes sluggishly, sometimes with terrifying speed, pushing through the walls like they had always belonged there. It was as if the very structure of the city was alive, and it was hunting him. He stumbled into an open square, and for a moment, he thought he had found a place to breathe. The square was eerily still, its cobblestones free from the disturbing movement that had gripped the streets. But as he took in his surroundings, something in his chest tightened with a familiar sense of wrongness. The buildings surrounding the square weren't just dilapidated, they were changing. The stone and brick seemed to shift in slow motion, their surfaces rippling as if something was pushing beneath them. Christopher's heart raced again. Was it the same force that had cracked the ground open? Was this some kind of curse, some dark energy that bled through time and space? Then he saw it. In the center of the square stood a fountain, its water frozen mid-flow, the surface cracked like glass. The fountain had an odd, disjointed shape, too tall, too narrow. Its edges were jagged, unnaturally so. As he walked closer, he noticed something he had missed in his initial panic: faces. They were carved into the stone of the fountain, their features contorted in agony, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent screams. The stone around them was chipped and broken, but their expressions were somehow fresh, as though they were alive, waiting. The faces began to move. At first, it was just a twitch, a slight shift in the expression of one of the figures. Then another, and another. Soon, they were all writhing, as though trapped beneath the stone, trying to claw their way out. The cracks in the fountain deepened, and the faces pressed against them, their eyes widening, their mouths stretching impossibly wide. The sound that came from the fountain was not human. It was a low, guttural moan, an unsettling, inhuman noise that vibrated in Christopher's chest, as though the stones were crying out for release. Christopher's feet were frozen. He wanted to run, but his body refused to obey. The laughter around him grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. He could feel the pull of the fountain, the suffocating presence of the faces. They were watching him. One face, its features barely distinguishable from the rest, turned to face him. Its eyes, once empty sockets, were now filled with dark, swirling shadows, like ink spilling into water. It opened its mouth, and Christopher could almost feel the words forming in the air between them. "Come closer," the face whispered, the voice like a distant memory, like an echo of something long forgotten. Christopher's mind reeled. This isn't real, he thought desperately, trying to push away the growing sense of inevitability that pressed on him from all sides. This is a dream. This is all in my head. But the faces kept moving. Their mouths kept stretching wider. The fountain seemed to grow taller, the stone bulging as though it were about to crack open completely. He knew then that he was not in control. This place, the Hollow City, had him. He had thought he could fight it. But now, the city was turning on him, and he was no longer sure if he was even meant to leave. The more he struggled, the more the walls of reality crumbled. The faces were pulling him in, whispering his name. They knew him. They had been waiting for him, and he was helpless to stop it. Christopher stood frozen, his mind swirling in a chaotic storm of disbelief and terror. The fountain's faces, those grotesque, contorted masks of pain, continued to move, their eyes locked onto his every twitch, every shudder. The laughter that had filled the Hollow City now rose in volume, reverberating around him, becoming an overwhelming cacophony that twisted reality itself. It was as though the city itself was alive, aware of his every move, feeding off his fear. The walls, the ground, the very air, everything felt as though it were closing in. But amidst the deafening laughter, there was something else. A voice, whispering, soft and smooth, slipping through the cracks in his mind. "You want to understand," it said, "but you can't. Not yet." Christopher's heart pounded in his chest, but despite the terror that gripped him, there was something else, an undeniable, gnawing curiosity. The Hollow City, these walls, these faces, they were all part of something far greater than his comprehension. The city wasn't just haunted by ghosts or demons. It was something far older, something deeper. And the faces, they weren't merely victims of this place. They were its keepers. The whispering voice continued, seeming to emanate from the fountain itself. "You seek the truth, but all truths come with a price." Christopher's breath caught. The words echoed in his mind, pulling him in despite his instincts screaming at him to flee. Was this what had brought him here? The insatiable need to uncover what lurked beneath the surface, the hunger for answers even in the face of unimaginable horror? He had been warned time and time again, by those who had disappeared, by those who had walked these cursed streets and never returned. But here he was still standing, still questioning. He wanted to speak, to ask the voice what it meant, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. The faces in the fountain were no longer just faces. They were eyes now, watching him with an intensity that pierced through the very fabric of his being. They seemed to be waiting for something. "What price?" he whispered, though the words tasted foreign in his mouth. The voice answered, almost tenderly, as if it had anticipated the question. The price is not for knowledge, but for forgetting. Once you know what you are about to learn, you cannot unlearn it. The city will change you. It will become a part of you, and you will never leave. Christopher's breath caught in his throat. The price of forgetting? The words didn't make sense, did they? Wasn't knowledge the very thing that had drawn him here? The Hollow City had been a place of myth and mystery, whispered about in the darkest corners of Philadelphia's history. A place that had lured people in with the promise of secrets, of forbidden knowledge. But now, standing on the precipice of understanding, he began to feel the weight of those promises. He began to understand that some knowledge was never meant to be uncovered. And yet, he could not turn away. He had to know. He had to see what lay beneath the surface. There was something in the city, something that had been waiting for him, for his kind. It was ancient, bound in ways that defied time. And he had felt it before. The pull of the Hollow City, the connection between him and this place that he could neither explain nor resist. "What do you want from me?" Christopher asked, his voice shaking but resolute. The whispering voice seemed to smile, if it was possible for a voice to smile. "What I want is for you to choose. The city does not make demands, it offers choices. Your path has already been set in motion, Christopher. All that remains is for you to accept your place within it." The faces in the fountain turned once more, their mouths stretching wider, their eyes gleaming with something ancient, something that was both a warning and an invitation. He could feel them watching him, feeling his hesitation, his reluctance to make the choice. They were waiting, expecting him to make the next move. He was beginning to understanding what they wanted, what they needed from him. The Hollow City wasn't just a place. It was a force, and it had been waiting for him, as though it had known he would come. Perhaps the city knew what he had long suspected, that there was more to this world, to his life, than the confines of reality. This city, this place, was the key to unlocking something far greater than any of them could comprehend. But at what cost? What was the price of knowing the truth about this place? Christopher felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The laughter around him faded for a moment, leaving a hollow silence, as though the city, the walls, and even the faces were holding their breath. He knew what they were waiting for, and though a part of him screamed in terror, a much larger part of him needed to understand, to know the truth. Even if it meant sacrificing his own sense of reality. He nodded slowly, his decision made. "I accept," he whispered, and the words echoed through the Hollow City, carrying with them a finality that could never be undone. As Christopher uttered those words, "I accept," he felt an immediate shift in the very air around him. It was as if the city itself exhaled, a slow, almost imperceptible release of breath that made the weight of the silence suffocating. The laughter, the whispers, and even the shifting walls stilled for a moment, as though the Hollow City was processing his decision. He had given himself to it, unknowingly sealing his fate. There was no going back. The fountain's faces ceased their grotesque movements, their eyes no longer shifting with hunger or malice. Instead, they stared at him, empty still. The stone around them began to crack and crumble, and for a fleeting moment, Christopher could have sworn he saw something beneath, something alive. It was a shifting mass, like dark liquid, pulsing and writhing beneath the stone, trying to break free. And then, as if on cue, the ground beneath him trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. It was more subtle, a trembling that came from deep within the earth itself. The walls of the square groaned, and the sky above them darkened, clouds swirling unnaturally fast as though they were caught in the grip of some unseen hand. Christopher could feel it now, a presence, ancient and malevolent, pressing against him, pushing him toward something, toward a truth that would rip apart everything he thought he knew. His mind raced. He had chosen to understand, but he had not known the true cost. The price of knowledge wasn't just the loss of innocence or sanity. It was the unraveling of the world itself. The city was coming undone, and in that unraveling, Christopher realized that he was the key to it all. He was not a victim here. He was the cause. The voice, the one that had whispered from the fountain, spoke again, though this time it was not in words but in a sensation, a knowing that filled his mind. "You have awoken it. the voice said. "You have opened the door. Now you will see the truth." The stone beneath his feet cracked wider, and a blinding light began to emanate from the fissures in the ground. It wasn't a light that illuminated, but one that consumed, a bright, fiery glow that swallowed everything in its path. It reached up, wrapping around the walls, the buildings, the sky itself, until the entire city was bathed in its terrible brilliance. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a deep, resonant hum, like the sound of something ancient stirring from its slumber. Christopher stumbled back, his heart racing, his breath shallow and quick. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape, but he was no longer sure if he could. The city had opened its doors to him, but now it seemed that the city had no intention of letting him leave. The ground continued to tremble, and the air grew thick, oppressive, as though every breath he took was filled with the weight of the city's secrets. It was then that he saw it. From the center of the square, from the broken fountain, something rose. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow that twisted and flickered in the light. But then it solidified slowly, painfully, into something more. It was a figure, its form shifting like smoke, its face a blur of shadows. Christopher couldn't make out its features, but he could feel its eyes upon him. It was watching him, assessing him. The figure took a step forward, its form coalescing into something more tangible. It was tall, impossibly so, its shape undefined and shifting like smoke in the wind. The laughter began again, but now it was not just a sound. It was a presence surrounding him, pressing against his mind. It was as though the figure was the city, and the city was the figure. They were one and the same. "You wanted the truth," the figure spoke, its voice a hollow, echoing sound that vibrated through his bones. "You wanted to see beyond the veil. But some truths are not meant to be seen. Some knowledge is too much for one mind to bear." Christopher felt his chest tighten, as if the figure's words were squeezing the life out of him. His thoughts became disjointed, his perception warped. The air around him grew thick with something dark, something alive, as if the very fabric of the world was stretching, unraveling at the seams. He wanted to close his eyes, to turn away, but there was no escape. The city was inside him now. The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward him, the shadows writhing in its grasp. Christopher could feel it, whatever it was, that it was pulling something from him. His memories, his thoughts, his very sense of self. Everything he had been, everything he was being ripped apart, thread by thread. It was as if the hollow city was pulling him into its core, into the very heart of its madness. But even as the figure's hand reached for him, Christopher found himself unable to stop it. He had accepted the truth, and now there was no turning back. The city had him, and it was reshaping him, unraveling his very existence. He was becoming part of it, and it was becoming part of him. The truth, whatever it was now his to bear. But the cost was everything. In the depths of his mind, he screamed. Christopher's vision blurred, and the weight of the city pressed heavier against him. The towering figure loomed, its dark shape now pulsating with a rhythm that felt eerily like a heartbeat. The air around him crackled with an electric tension, and he could feel the ground beneath him shift once again. His limbs grew heavy, his thoughts jumbled, as if the very fabric of his consciousness was being pulled in different directions. The hollow city had taken root inside him, and he was no longer sure where he ended and it began. The figure's hand stretched closer, and with every inch it moved, Christopher felt the boundaries between his mind and the city dissolve. In that moment, he realized that the city was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity. It was a parasite that fed on the minds of those who ventured too close, unraveling them bit by bit, consuming their very essence until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. And he had fallen victim to it. But before the figure could touch him, the ground beneath him cracked open once again, sending a shockwave of energy through the square. The air trembled as if the city itself was in pain, and Christopher felt a sudden jolt of fear. He wasn't alone. There were others who had been here before him, and their presence was as much a part of the city as the walls and streets themselves. Their whispers filled his ears, growing louder with each passing second, like a chorus of forgotten souls. The figure faltered for a brief moment, as if it too could feel the shifting presence of these other beings. The city seemed to respond, the walls creaking and groaning in protest. And then, from the cracks in the earth, they emerged, ghostly figures, their forms pale and insubstantial, moving with an unnatural grace. They drifted in and out of view, their faces twisted with anguish, their eyes wide and empty. They were the forgotten ones, the lost souls who had once walked the streets of the Hollow City, only to be consumed by it, trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. Christopher could hear their voices now, low and sorrowful, their words like a mournful wail carried on the wind. "You are not the first," they whispered. "You will not be the last." The words were both a warning and a curse, as if the city had a hunger that could never be sated. Christopher tried to speak, to ask who they were, but no words escaped his lips. It was as if his voice had been stolen from him, silenced by the weight of their presence. As the ghostly figures continued to materialize around him, Christopher began to notice something strange. The figures were not random. They were familiar in a way that he couldn't fully comprehend. Faces from his past, faces of people he had known, people he had lost over the years, flickered in and out of the shadows. A childhood friend, a lover he hadn't seen in years, a family member whose death had haunted him for years. And then it struck him. The figures were not just lost souls. They were memories from his own life, twisted and distorted by the city's insidious power. The Hollow City didn't just consume its victims. It reshaped them, turning them into echoes of the past, trapped in an endless cycle of regret and sorrow. Christopher's heart raced as he realized the horrifying truth. He had been here before, and the city had claimed him long ago, erasing the very memories that could have warned him of his fate. He tried to move, to escape, but his legs felt heavy, as if they were bound by invisible chains. The figures began to close in around him, their mournful eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, drowning out all other sounds. "You are one of us now," they whispered in unison. "There is no escaping the Hollow City. There is no escape from the past." Christopher wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The more he struggled, the more the figures surrounded him, their hands reaching out to touch him, to pull him deeper into the city's grip. The faces of his lost loved ones twisted in agony, their eyes wide with fear and desperation. It was as if they were trying to warn him, to pull him back from the brink, but the city's hold on him was too strong. The ground beneath him shifted once more, and with a final, gut-wrenching lurch, Christopher felt himself fall into darkness. His vision blurred, and the whispering voices faded into nothingness. He was suspended in a void, caught between the city and the ghosts of his past, unable to move, unable to escape. He was trapped, lost in the labyrinth of the Hollow City, and the truth, whatever it was slipping further and further from his grasp. And yet, amidst the silence that now enveloped him, one thought burned through his mind with clarity. He had made a choice. He had opened the door to the city, and now he was paying the price. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. The Hollow City had claimed him, and in doing so, it had erased him, replacing him with an echo, a shadow of the person he once was. Christopher had become a part of the city's dark, twisted history, and there was no telling if he would ever emerge again. Time seemed irrelevant in the Hollow City, stretching and folding like the walls around Christopher. He had lost all sense of how long he had been drifting in that suffocating darkness, surrounded by the ghostly figures that haunted his every thought. Yet, as the city seemed to pulsate with its own twisted rhythm, Christopher found himself aware of a growing weight in the air, a tension that pulled at the very fabric of his mind. It was as if something was about to break, something important, something that would change everything. The figures, though once haunting, no longer seemed quite as malevolent. As Christopher lingered in the stifling dark, he began to understand the complex nature of these souls. They weren't just memories, as he had first thought. They were remnants of choices, reflections of paths he could have taken. The Hollow City was not merely a prison for lost souls. It was a mirror. And now, for the first time since his arrival, Christopher started to perceive the strange truth that lay at its heart. The city had no true shape. It was a culmination of all the decisions, regrets, and forgotten wishes that people left behind. Suddenly, as if responding to his thoughts, the oppressive darkness shifted. Light, faint but sharp, cut through the void, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked ground. The ghostly figures receded slightly, their whispering voices fading into the background. Before him, a passage appeared, one that had not been there before. It was narrow and winding, and though it looked like it would lead him deeper into the city, there was an undeniable allure that drew him closer. Christopher hesitated at the entrance. His mind raced with questions. Could this be another trick of the Hollow City, or was this his chance to escape? For the first time since he had arrived, there was a momentary feeling of clarity, as if the city itself had granted him a reprieve. He had seen the horrors, felt the weight of the past clawing at him. But this passage felt different. It was not like the dead ends and unending corridors he had encountered before. It was a place that beckoned, as though it was waiting for him to step forward. The further he ventured into the passage, the more the oppressive weight lifted. The walls, once gnarled and close, now opened up into a wider expanse. The air was fresher, and though the faint whispers of the past still lingered at the edges of his consciousness, they no longer held the same power over him. The passage seemed to guide him, pushing him towards something beyond his understanding. Yet, the further he walked, the more Christopher felt as though he were being watched. There was a constant presence around him, like eyes that never blinked, always observing his every move. The feeling was unnerving, but he pressed on. Each step seemed to take him farther away from the oppressive presence of the Hollow City itself, yet closer to a place he could not yet comprehend. He could feel his body growing lighter, his senses sharpening. Then, as he reached the end of the passage, the atmosphere shifted once again. What appeared to be the end of the tunnel opened up into a vast expanse, a sprawling room unlike any he had seen before. The floor was made of smooth stone, and in the center of the room stood a large, imposing figure. It was not the towering entity he had seen before. This was different, more human, yet still unsettling. Its features were a blur, as if they shifted with every glance. The figure did not move, but Christopher felt its presence pressing against him. The air grew thick with a sense of anticipation. He could not look away from it, and though his heart pounded in his chest, a strange calm settled over him. The figure seemed to emanate power, but it was not threatening. It was simply waiting for something, for him. Suddenly, a voice, not from the figure, but from within the walls themselves, echoed in Christopher's mind. The city knows you. It knows your fears, your regrets, but it is also a reflection of you. You have been a part of it since the moment you stepped through its door. Do you understand now? The voice was not one that he could hear in the physical world, but it resonated within him, reverberating through his every thought. The weight of its words pressed down on him, forcing him to confront the question he had been avoiding for so long. Do you understand now? The question rang in his ears, louder than the whispers of the ghostly figures, more forceful than the figure before him. The Hollow City, the passage, the whispers, all of it had been a test, a mirror of his own fears and choices. He had entered the city to escape, to find answers, but in reality, the city had been leading him to confront himself. All of it, the city, the figures, the silence, was a part of him, shaped by the choices he had made, the paths he had not taken. Christopher's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the stone floor, overwhelmed by the weight of this realization. The Hollow City was not some separate, haunted place. It was him, his own fractured psyche, his own regrets, fears, and desires manifesting in the form of a living nightmare. The figure in front of him, the voice, the passage, it was all a reflection of his inner turmoil. He had been running, hiding from his own mind, and now there was nowhere left to hide. As the realization hit him, the figure before him shifted, its form becoming clearer, more defined. Its face began to emerge from the blur, and Christopher saw that it was not a stranger at all. It was him, a twisted version of himself, a reflection of everything he had been too afraid to face. The city had brought him here not to punish him, but to make him confront the very core of who he was and what he had become. There was no escape from the Hollow City, because it was not a place. It was a part of him. In the moments following the realization that the Hollow City was nothing more than a reflection of his fractured psyche, Christopher's mind reeled. The twisted version of himself, the dark figure standing before him in the silent expanse, was not an apparition, but an embodiment of all his self-loathing, guilt, and unresolved emotions. It was an unsettling truth, one that had been buried deep within him, hidden from his own awareness. But now, with the city pressing in on him, there was no denying it. The Hollow City was not some supernatural force beyond his comprehension. It was a mirror, showing him the consequences of his own choices and the parts of himself that he had refused to face. The figure, his distorted reflection, stared at him with eyes full of accusation. The gaze was unblinking, cold, as though it could see directly into the depths of his soul. Christopher felt exposed, naked in a way he had never experienced before. There was nowhere left to hide. The walls of the Hollow City, which had once seemed like an oppressive labyrinth, now felt like an open space, an arena where his inner conflict would play out. It was difficult for Christopher to even breathe, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of the figure's presence. He had spent so much time running from his past, seeking refuge in the false safety of denial. But now, there was no escape. Every inch of the Hollow City, every shadow that moved within it, seemed to be a reflection of a choice he had made or avoided. The city was not simply a prison of lost souls. It was a prison of his own making. And standing before him now was the part of him that he had tried to suppress for so long. "Why?" Christopher whispered, his voice raw with emotion. He barely recognized himself in the figure before him. It was him, yet it wasn't. It was an exaggerated, nightmarish version of himself, one that embodied all the flaws and failings he had tried to bury. And yet it was real. This figure was a part of him, an undeniable truth he could no longer ignore. The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it raised its hand, and the space around them seemed to shift. The walls of the room faded, replaced by images that flickered in and out of focus. His memories, flashed before his eyes. The moments he had long since forgotten, the faces he had tried to erase, all came rushing back in a torrent of overwhelming sensations. He saw his childhood, the strained relationship with his parents, the unresolved arguments, the moments of silence that spoke louder than words. He saw his lost friendships, the betrayals, the people he had abandoned in pursuit of something. What? Success? Recognition? A sense of belonging? As the images continued to whirl around him, Christopher was struck by one memory in particular. It was a time when he had stood at a crossroads in his life, a moment when he had made a decision that would shape the course of his future. He had chosen a path that had seemed right at the time, but now, in the harsh light of the Hollow City, it appeared as a mistake. He had chosen ambition over connection, career over relationships, and in doing so, he had driven away those who had once cared for him. The guilt of that choice was unbearable, suffocating him in this ghostly place. The figure, his reflection, was not simply a manifestation of his past. It was the embodiment of the consequences of those choices. Why did you leave them behind? The question came not from the figure, but from somewhere within Christopher himself. It was a voice that echoed through his mind, a voice he had silenced for too long. It was the voice of regret, the voice of someone who had lost sight of what truly mattered. The Hollow City had been his escape, but now it had become his reckoning. Tears welled up in Christopher's eyes as the weight of his own actions crushed him. He had believed that success, that achieving his dreams, would bring him peace. But it hadn't. All he had found was emptiness, and now, standing in the midst of this broken city, he realized that the emptiness had been inside him all along. He had never truly confronted the damage he had done to others and to himself. He had pushed people away, closed doors that should have remained open, and in doing so, he had created a void that no achievement could fill. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. But this time, Christopher did not recoil. He stood his ground, facing the reflection of his own failures, the embodiment of everything he had neglected to acknowledge. The figure raised its hand once more, but this time, it was not an attack. The air around them shimmered, and Christopher felt something shift within him. A sudden clarity washed over him, like a light breaking through the fog. The figure, his reflection, was not there to punish him. It was there to show him the way forward. For the first time since entering the Hollow City, Christopher understood what he needed to do. It was not enough to simply confront the past. He had to make amends, to face the people he had hurt, to rebuild the connections he had lost. The Hollow City was not a place of eternal torment. It was a place of transformation, a chance to reclaim what had been lost. But that reclamation could only begin with acceptance. He could not change the past, but he could choose how to move forward. With a deep breath, Christopher straightened up, feeling a surge of determination rise within him. The figure before him began to fade, its form dissolving into the air as the room shifted once more. The Hollow City, once so oppressive and suffocating, now seemed less like a prison and more like a crossroads. Christopher had been given a choice, not just to escape, but to change, to heal, to rebuild. As the last remnants of the figure disappeared, Christopher turned and walked toward the newly formed path ahead. The city was still dark, still twisted, but there was a new sense of purpose within him. The Hollow City was not the end. It was merely the beginning of his journey toward redemption. In that moment, Christopher realized that the journey he had been on was not just about survival. It was about understanding. Understanding himself, understanding the choices he had made and learning from them. And with that understanding came the possibility of healing. As Christopher continued his journey through the Hollow City, a newfound clarity settled within him. The reflection, the twisted version of himself, had shown him a part of his soul he had long ignored. Now, the city no longer seemed like an impenetrable labyrinth of torment. It was a place of reckoning, a space where his past could be examined, understood, and ultimately reconciled. But with each step, he couldn't shake the nagging question that had been haunting him since the encounter. Could redemption truly be possible for someone like him? The streets of the Hollow City remained dimly lit, the sky above an unyielding shade of gray. The air was thick with a sense of something looming, an oppressive energy that had yet to fully dissipate. It wasn't fear he felt now, but anticipation. He wasn't just walking through the city, he was walking towards something larger than himself. What he had once perceived as punishment, as an endless purgatory, was now beginning to feel like a strange form of opportunity. The city, in its bleakness, was offering him a chance to redefine himself, to confront the fractures within his own life, and to rebuild. As Christopher passed through the narrow, winding streets, he could hear distant voices echoing in the background, like whispers of lost souls. The Hollow City seemed alive, breathing, watching him. He had become acutely aware of every movement, every shift in the environment around him. It was as if the city itself was responding to his thoughts, reacting to his growing resolve. Yet, despite the sinister ambience, he no longer felt trapped. There was a purpose in his stride, a goal he had not fully recognized until now. The path he walked was unmarked, undefined. It seemed as though the city was shifting around him, creating a maze that only he could navigate. The unsettling sense of uncertainty still gripped him, but this time it was different. The fear, which had once paralyzed him, had been replaced by a quiet determination. Each step he took seemed to affirm the belief that redemption was not some distant ideal, but a tangible reality, something he could reach for, something he could grasp. Still, doubt lingered. He had spent years in the real world running from responsibility, avoiding difficult conversations, avoiding the necessary acts of reckoning. Was it truly possible to make things right, to confront the people he had abandoned, the hurt he had caused? He had always believed that success, power, and distance were the antidotes to pain. that climbing higher would somehow numb the weight of his past. Yet standing here in the hollow city, that facade crumbled. All the external achievements, his job, his money, his isolated triumphs, were hollow. They had done nothing to heal the fractures within him, to mend the relationships he had destroyed. But now, he was seeing things differently. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about pretending that nothing had ever gone wrong. Redemption was about confronting his choices head-on, owning his mistakes, and most importantly, changing. It was a choice, not just to seek forgiveness, but to live differently, to rebuild what had been broken, not just in others, but in himself. As Christopher continued walking, he encountered a series of figures, shadows moving into corners of his vision. These figures were not like the twisted reflections of himself. They were familiar, faces he hadn't seen in years, people he had long since lost touch with, now appeared before him in the shadows of the city. Some of their faces were twisted in pain, others were simply neutral, emotionless. But one face, one figure, stood out to him above all the others: Rachel. The woman he had once loved, the one he had pushed away in his pursuit of success. She stood a few steps ahead of him, her back turned, as though waiting for him to catch up. The hollow emptiness of her figure was both haunting and familiar. Her presence made his heart tighten. He had never allowed himself to think about her. He had buried that part of his past so deep that it had almost become a distant memory. But now, seeing her here in the hollow city, he realized how much he had missed her, how much he had failed her. The guilt was suffocating, and yet it was the most honest emotion he had felt in a long time. "Rachel," he said, his voice shaking. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like a cry from a past life. She didn't turn around, but he could see her shoulders tense. The silence between them stretched, as though the air itself was holding its breath. "Do you think it's too late?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question wasn't just for her, it was for himself. He had spent so long telling himself that time had passed, that the opportunities had been lost, that it was too late to go back. But now, standing here, facing his regrets, he wasn't so sure. Could he make amends? Could they find a way back to what they had lost? Rachel didn't respond at first. She remained silent, her figure still and motionless. But then, slowly she turned. Her face was expressionless, but there was a depth to her gaze that cut through him. The absence of words between them spoke volumes. Rachel had already experienced the consequences of his choices. She had moved on long ago, and yet, here she was in the hollow city, waiting for him, waiting to see if he was truly ready to face the weight of his actions. "I don't know," Rachel said softly, her voice carrying a quiet sadness. "I don't know if it's too late, but the question is, do you?" The words hung in the air, leaving Christopher speechless. He didn't know if it was too late, but in that moment he understood something profound. The hollow city wasn't a place of eternal punishment. It was a place of choice, of change. And as long as he was breathing, it was never too late to begin again. With a deep breath, Christopher stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He wasn't sure what the future held, whether he could ever truly make things right, but one thing was clear. He was no longer the man who had walked into this city. He was someone else now, someone who was ready to face the darkness within him, to confront the broken parts of his past, and to rebuild what had been lost. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. The city had changed again. After Christopher's brief encounter with Rachel, the landscape around him seemed to shift in subtle ways. The air was heavier, laden with a sense of finality. Yet, as much as he wished to find some comfort in the idea of redemption, the hollow city did not let up. It was not a place of easy answers, nor was it a space for simple resolutions. It was a realm that demanded sacrifice and introspection, a place that pushed him further into the recesses of his psyche, unraveling layers he had long since buried. Yet, something within him stirred, a sense that he was inching closer to understanding, to reaching the heart of the city itself. Christopher walked deeper into the heart of the hollow city, where the streets grew darker and the walls seemed to close in around him. The buildings appeared less like structures and more like towering sentinels, watching over him with an almost omnipotent presence. Their windows were black, reflecting only his distorted image. It was as if the city itself had taken on a consciousness, perceiving him, testing him. Every step he took felt as though he were being drawn toward a singular point, as though the city was funneling him towards something significant, something he couldn't yet comprehend. As he walked, the distance between him and his past seemed to shrink. The events of his life, his mistakes, his regrets, became clearer, more defined. He could hear the voices of those he had wronged, the echoes of their pain and disappointment reverberating through the hollowed streets. For a moment, he wondered if the city was trying to torture him, if this relentless force was meant to break him down completely. But then he realized something more profound. The city wasn't here to break him. It was here to teach him. It was a crucible, a place of purification, where only the truth would survive. The deeper he ventured, the more the city seemed to reflect his inner turmoil. It was a mirror, reflecting not just the mistakes he had made, but the man he had become because of them. Yet, unlike the twisted version of himself he had encountered before, this version wasn't distorted by anger or pride. It was raw, unfiltered, and vulnerable. It was the part of him he had long suppressed, the part that wanted to feel, to connect, to be truly seen. The hollow city, in all its darkness, was offering him the chance to see himself fully for the first time. But the journey inward was not without its dangers. The further Christopher walked, the more the environment seemed to shift. The shadows grew longer, the air colder. The city was alive with movement, but it wasn't the kind of life he had come to expect. This was a more sinister kind of vitality, an energy that pulsed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Christopher could feel the ground beneath his feet begin to shift, and the very air around him seemed to tighten, as if the city itself were holding its breath. It wasn't until he reached the center of the hollow city that he truly understood. The city wasn't a maze, a series of random streets or decaying buildings. It was a heart, an organism pulsing with an energy far greater than he had ever imagined. And at the very center of this heart, at the core of everything, was a single truth. Christopher had been running from himself for far too long. He had tried to bury his guilt, his regrets, and his mistakes, but the hollow city was forcing him to confront them head-on. No longer could he avoid the pain that lay dormant within him. No longer could he hide behind his accomplishments or his illusions of success. Standing at the center of the city, Christopher felt a weight pressed down on him. It was not an external force, but an internal one, the weight of his own realizations. He had spent so much of his life focusing on the future, on the next achievement, the next goal. But in doing so, he had failed to live fully in the present, to reconcile with the past, to truly understand the depth of the consequences of his actions. In this moment, he understood that his journey through the hollow city was not about finding answers, but about accepting the questions, the unresolved pieces of his life that had been left behind. And then, as if responding to his newfound awareness, the city began to shift once again. The walls around him melted away, revealing a vast, open space. At the center of this space stood a figure, tall, imposing, and yet strangely familiar. Christopher's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure before him. It was himself, but not the version of himself he had encountered earlier. This figure was older, more weathered, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of every decision he had ever made. It was the version of himself that had lived through the pain, the regret, the loss. It was the version that had allowed him to get to this point. "You've come far," the figure spoke, its voice echoing in the vast space. "But are you ready to face what's left of you?" Christopher didn't know how to respond. He had been prepared to confront his mistakes, to face his past, but standing before this figure, this embodiment of all his wrongs, he felt small, insignificant. Yet, there was no turning back. The hollow city had brought him here for a reason, and it was in this moment that he realized what that reason was: to face himself in all his complexity, in all his flaws. "I'm ready," Christopher said, his voice trembling. It wasn't a declaration of confidence, but a quiet acceptance. For the first time, he was ready to let go of the parts of himself that had been holding him captive. He was ready to face the consequences, to confront the pain, and to acknowledge that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it. The figure before him nodded, and in that moment, the ground beneath Christopher's feet began to tremble. The city was alive, reacting to his acceptance, to his willingness to confront the truth. It was no longer a place of punishment. It was a place of transformation. The Hollow City had given him a choice, and now, for the first time, he could see the way forward. As the city continued to shift around him, Christopher took a deep breath and stepped forward. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain. The journey was far from over. And with each step, he was moving closer to the man he was meant to be. The Hollow City was no longer a maze of confusion and decay. It had become something altogether more profound, a reflection of Christopher's mind, his soul, his very essence. The journey that had once seemed endless, with its twists and turns, its oppressive silence, and its suffocating atmosphere, now felt strangely serene. But the serenity was deceptive, for Christopher knew that the hardest part of his journey had not yet arrived. He had faced his past, stared into the abyss of his own mistakes, and found a version of himself that was both burdened and free. Now, the city was testing him again. This time, not with the ghosts of his past, but with the weight of the future. It had been an unsettling realization, this knowledge that the Hollow City was a mirror, not just of his past, but also of his potential futures. Each step he had taken brought him closer to understanding that the choices he made now, how he responded to the challenges before him, would shape not just his destiny, but the very fabric of his being. And yet, the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. The city had shown him the way, but it had not given him the answers. Instead, it had led him to the precipice of a choice that was his alone to make. A choice between letting go and holding on, between accepting the truth of who he was and attempting to rewrite the narrative of his life. The figure that had appeared to him in the center of the city was gone now, its presence lingering only as a faint impression in Christopher's mind. He could still hear its words, still feel the weight of its gaze. It had been a manifestation of all that he had refused to acknowledge, a symbol of the unresolved parts of himself that he had buried deep within. And now, as the city shifted again, as the walls began to close in around him once more, Christopher felt the pull of that presence. It was as if the Hollow City itself was urging him to make his choice, to confront the reality that had been waiting for him all along. The question was simple, though the answer was far from clear. Would he leave the city, the place that had forced him to face himself in ways he had never imagined? Would he return to the world he had known, to the life he had once lived, knowing that he could never be the same again? Or would he remain, embracing the lessons the city had taught him, choosing to remain in the labyrinth of his own mind for the rest of his days? Christopher took a deep breath, the air thick with the weight of the decision. He had always prided himself on his ability to make decisions quickly, to take action without hesitation. But this moment was different. The choice before him wasn't about what he would do next. It was about who he would become. Every part of him screamed for resolution, for closure, for the comfort of knowing that his past would no longer define him. But the Hollow City had made it clear that there was no easy resolution, no neat ending. Life, like the city, was messy, unpredictable, and filled with contradictions. As he walked through the shifting streets, he was reminded of the choices he had made in the past, choices that had led him to this moment. Each misstep, each moment of hesitation, had contributed to the man he was today. There was no going back, no undoing the past. But there was something more, the possibility of change. The Hollow City had forced him to confront his past, yes, but it had also given him the opportunity to look beyond it, to see the potential for a future that was not defined by his mistakes. But the question remained, could he truly leave this place behind? Could he leave behind the lessons, the growth, the transformation that the city had instilled in him? The idea of returning to the world outside, the world that had once felt so familiar, so comforting, now seemed alien. A place where the lessons he had learned in the Hollow City would be forgotten, buried beneath the noise of daily life. The city had shown him the path, but the world outside would demand that he forget it. And yet, there was a part of him that longed for the simplicity of the world outside, for the familiarity of the life he had once known. The city, despite its darkness and its trials, had given him clarity. But was that clarity enough to face the reality of the world beyond its walls? Could he live in a place that seemed so indifferent to the kind of growth he had experienced here? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Christopher felt the ground beneath him tremble. The Hollow City was not content to let him linger in indecision. It was alive, and it was pushing him toward an answer. The walls around him shifted, the streets narrowing, as if the city itself were closing in. The choice was upon him. He had to decide. Taking another deep breath, Christopher closed his eyes. He could feel the weight of the city's presence pressing against him, but also the weight of his own heart, his own desires, his own needs. What did he truly want? What did he need to move forward? "I'm ready," he whispered to no one in particular, but to the city itself, to the version of himself that had brought him here, and to the world that awaited him beyond the Hollow City's gates. For the first time in his journey, Christopher felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that no matter the choice, no matter the outcome, he had grown. He had faced his darkest fears, his greatest regrets, and had come out the other side with a new understanding of who he was. And now, he was ready to leave the Hollow City behind, to step into the unknown future that awaited him, armed with the lessons he had learned and the person he had become. The city began to fade, the darkness lifting as the light broke through. The world beyond was waiting, and Christopher was no longer afraid to face it. When Christopher finally stepped out of the Hollow City, it was as if the very air had changed. The moment he crossed the threshold, the weight of the past seemed to lift from his shoulders, yet the unease that followed was palpable. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic shift that marked his transition from the surreal landscape of the Hollow City to the mundane reality of the outside world. It was almost anticlimactic, but as he walked through the streets of Philadelphia, something told him that the real journey had only just begun. The city had been quieter than usual, the streets oddly empty for a place that was always bustling with life. It was as though the world outside had been waiting for him, too, a world that had been suspended in time until his return. Christopher felt both grounded and detached, as though his mind had yet to fully catch up with his body. The city was familiar, and yet everything felt foreign. The once comforting chaos of Philadelphia's streets, the sounds of traffic, the voices of strangers, now felt jarring, like a dissonant note in a symphony that had once been harmonious. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The people around him moved with a sense of urgency, their faces blurring past him, disconnected from the world he now inhabited. But Christopher didn't feel the need to rush. He had learned something during his time in the Hollow City. Something about slowing down, about taking the time to notice the details that once seemed insignificant. Now, as he walked, he observed the world around him with new eyes, noticing the small moments of beauty, the fleeting expressions on people's faces, the way the light reflected off the wet pavement after the rain. But beneath the surface of this newfound clarity, something darker was stirring. The memories of the Hollow City, the things he had confronted there, the choices he had made, were not as easily dismissed as he had hoped. In fact, they seemed to be seeping back into his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting thought, a vague sensation of being watched. But over time, the feeling grew, and Christopher began to question whether he had truly left the Hollow City behind. Was it still a part of him? Had it simply taken on a new form in the outside world? Or was this the real horror? That his mind had not fully relinquished its grip on the city, that he had brought the very essence of it with him? The more he tried to push these thoughts aside, the more they consumed him. Strange occurrences began to unfold around him, things he could not explain. People he knew began to act differently, as if they were playing roles in a script he couldn't read. Conversations that once felt natural now seemed rehearsed, their words empty, their emotions hollow. The faces of his friends and family appeared unfamiliar, as though they were distorted versions of themselves, their expressions cold, their eyes distant. It was as if they were merely shadows of the people he had known, echoes of the past that no longer held meaning. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, haunting dreams that twisted the line between reality and nightmare. In these dreams, the Hollow City was still there, waiting for him. But it was no longer the place of reflection and transformation it had once been. Now, it was a prison, a never-ending maze from which there was no escape. The streets he had once walked with purpose now stretched on infinitely, each turn leading to another dead end. The figure that had guided him through the city's labyrinth was no longer a comfort. It had become an ominous presence, a reminder of his own inability to break free. Christopher found himself caught in a cycle of fear and confusion, questioning what was real and what was illusion. He could no longer trust his senses. Was the Hollow City still inside him, or was it something more? Was it possible that it had never really left, that it had only shifted forms, becoming a part of the world he had returned to? These thoughts consumed him day and night, eroding his sense of self. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, the walls began to close in on him. The air grew thick, the temperature dropped, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. He knew, without a doubt, that he was not alone. It was the Hollow City, or something like it, following him, haunting him. His heart raced as he stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. The door to his apartment rattled, a slow, deliberate knock resonating through the silence. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure whether he was ready to face whatever awaited him on the other side. Taking a deep breath, Christopher opened the door. There was no one there, just the empty hallway stretching out in both directions. But as he looked down, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A small, discarded object lay at his feet, a broken piece of a mirror. The glass shimmered in the dim light, and as he bent down to pick it up, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection. But it wasn't his face he saw. It was a face twisted with anguish, eyes wide with fear, and a mouth that whispered his name. The mirror shattered in his hands, the fragments scattering across the floor, but the image remained, burned into his mind. The Hollow City had followed him, and now it was within him, its presence a constant, gnawing reminder that escape was never truly possible. The choice had always been an illusion. There was no leaving the Hollow City. It had become a part of who he was, a shadow that would never dissipate. And as Christopher stood in the empty hallway, the weight of this realization pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever felt before. The question was no longer whether he could escape, but whether he could learn to live with the presence of the Hollow City inside him. Could he find a way to live in the real world, knowing that the city's darkness would forever be a part of him? Or was he destined to be consumed by it, to live in a state of perpetual unraveling? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Christopher's journey was far from over. It had merely entered a new, more unsettling phase. As Christopher stood at the edge of the city, gazing out at the horizon where the sun was slowly sinking beneath the skyline, a strange sense of finality hung in the air. The streets below him, once pulsing with life, now seemed empty, their sounds muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. It was as if the weight of everything that had happened, the journey through the Hollow City, the madness, the horror, the confrontations with his deepest fears, had led him here, to this singular moment in time. But for all the clarity he felt in this stillness, something gnawed at him, a whisper in the back of his mind that he could not silence. The city below, so familiar, was now distorted by the lens of his experiences. He had seen it through the eyes of someone who had traveled beyond its borders, beyond the limits of what was tangible and understood. And yet, even now, after everything, he realized that the world had not truly changed. It was the same city, filled with the same people, locked in their own cycles, their own patterns of behavior, oblivious to the deeper truth that Christopher had discovered. He had witnessed the veil slip away, and in its place, the raw, chaotic undercurrents of the world had been revealed. But in the wake of that revelation, he had only found more questions. Was it the Hollow City that had changed him, or had the city simply uncovered the parts of himself that he had long ignored? Had it awakened something buried deep within, a darkness that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged? The more he pondered these questions, the more he realized that there was no simple answer. The Hollow City, for all its horror, had never been a place outside of him. It was a reflection of his own psyche, a manifestation of the fears, doubts, and regrets that had festered within him for so long. In the end, the Hollow City was not a location. It was a state of mind, a frame of reference for the internal landscape he had spent years running from. As he walked through the streets, each step seemed to echo with the past. The familiar buildings loomed overhead, casting long shadows that stretched into the night. The faces of the people he passed were as blank and indifferent as ever, but now they seemed to belong to a different world. It was not just that they were unaware of the horrors he had witnessed, but that they, too, were part of the same web of illusion. Everyone, it seemed, was living a version of reality that was just as constructed as the one he had inhabited in the Hollow City. The difference now was that he could see it, the fragility of everything, the thin veil that separated truth from fiction. In the days that followed, Christopher found himself drawn to the places he had once frequented, the places that had been his refuge before the Hollow City had made him question everything. The coffee shop on the corner, the old bookstore where he used to lose himself in novels, the quiet park bench by the river. All of these places now felt strange, as though they were relics of a past life. But it wasn't just the places that had changed. It was the people. They too had become part of the dream, actors playing roles in a story that no longer made sense. Conversations felt hollow, their meanings elusive, as if he were listening to words but unable to grasp their significance. And yet, Christopher did not feel the anger he once might have expected. The resentment that had followed him like a shadow, the desire to break free from the constraints of his life, had faded. In its place was something different, something akin to resignation. He had seen the dark heart of the world, the endless cycles of repetition, and he had come to understand that escape was not the answer. There was no escaping the Hollow City, no breaking free from the maze of illusion. It wasn't about fighting against it or trying to leave it behind. It was about accepting it for what it was, accepting that it was as much a part of him as the air he breathed. This acceptance did not mean that he was happy or that he had found peace. Far from it. There were still moments when the weight of the city, both the real one and the one within him, felt unbearable. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when he could see the world with a kind of detached understanding. He no longer felt compelled to escape or to search for meaning outside of himself. The meaning, he realized, was in the acceptance of the search itself. The pursuit of truth, of understanding, was a journey that had no destination, a journey that was both endless and eternal. As the days turned into weeks, Christopher began to sense that the real horror of his experience had not been the Hollow City itself, but the revelation of how deeply ingrained the illusion of control was in every part of his life. He had spent so long trying to hold on to something, anything, to keep himself grounded in a world that seemed to slip through his fingers. But now, he understood that the only thing he had ever truly controlled was his own perception, and even that had been an illusion. The world, the people, the city, it was all part of a dance, an intricate web of cause and effect that had no beginning and no end. There was no grand finale, no climactic moment of resolution. There was only the quiet hum of life continuing, as it always had, as it always would. And as Christopher walked through the streets, he realized that this was the truth he had been searching for all along. Not to escape, not to fight against the inevitable, but to embrace the cycles, the patterns, and the endless unfolding of the story that was his life. The Hollow City was not a place to fear, nor was it a place to escape. It was a mirror that reflected not the world outside, but the depths of his own soul. In the end, Christopher understood that the journey he had embarked on had no true destination. It was a journey of acceptance, of understanding that there was no escape from the world as it was. He would never fully be free of the Hollow City, but perhaps that was the point. The real horror was not in being trapped, but in realizing that freedom had never existed in the first place. It was in that realization that Christopher found his peace. not in the absence of the hollow city, but in the acceptance of its presence within him. And as he walked away from the edge of the city, he knew that his journey, though different now, was far from over.